action films, the only type of movie where a lone hero can take on an entire coalition of dastardly villains armed with nothing more than his two hands, a twinkle in his eye, and enough explosives to make a pyrotechnician blush. Because, let's face it, in action movies, subtlety is just a fancy word for not enough booms. They are the one film type that fuses violence with implausible ridiculousness, and people love them for it. So, come along with us as we take a brief look at the history of action films. Back in 1903, when dinosaurs still roamed the earth, there emerged a cinematic masterpiece known as The Great Train Robbery. It was like a Marvel movie, but in the silent film era. It had train robberies, obviously. It had gunfights. It had fisticuffs. Collectively, just enough violence to earn it the tagline of the first action movie ever. But the first heyday of action films would actually be considered the 1920s to the 1930s. During this time, one of the first major action film stars was a guy named Douglas Fairbanks. Fairbanks was charming and acrobatic, and he was well known for playing the character Zorro in the 1920 film The Mark of Zorro. He portrayed Zorro as a skilled swashbuckler, just as he was supposed to. And Zorro proved to Hollywood that action films could be quite profitable. Now, although Zorro was a silent film, it was only a matter of time before film found its sound. And this led to a similarly popular actor being chosen to play another iconic role. That actor's name was Errol Flynn, and that character was Robin Hood. Errol Flynn was a guy the ladies might call dashing back in the day. His charisma and athleticism elevated him to the status of Hollywood heartthrob. Now together, Fairbanks' portrayal of Zorro and Flynn's portrayal of Robin Hood really started giving people unrealistic expectations for what you can actually do with a sword. And that essentially set the standard for all the, yeah right, that could never happen, that we would see in future action films. Some films released during the late 30s, early 40s during the height of the World War were used as propaganda, and they were often employed to indoctrinate people into joining military service. Some of the films were crafted to make traveling, adventure, and bravery seem fun and rewarding, while other films outright encouraged patriotism. Now, during the 1930s to 1940s era, another major star stepped up, and his name was John Wayne. He was typically the main star of a lot of westerns and a lot of war films. He was partially chosen for these roles given his height, as he stood 6'4", so he towered above a lot of other leading men. For the most part, westerns and war films were essentially the action films of the time. If we jump ahead to the 1960s and 1970s, we see the rise of the anti-hero, rebels, who didn't just break the rules, they punched the rules in the mouth, and then did a donut in a muscle car to celebrate. Gone were the good guys that were good guys. In came the era of characters who would rather deliver a sarcastic one-liner than recite an inspiring monologue. And if they didn't have a sarcastic one-liner to say, then their fist or their gun would say it for them. A great example of this would be the legendary James Bond films. James Bond was often played by Sean Connery, and this film popularized the spy costume, a leisure suit with a cocktail and a side of sass. Shaken, not stirred. This time period also introduced Bruce Lee, the man who could strike faster than your eyes could follow. Martial arts films took center stage during this time period, and Bruce Lee was the maestro of high-flying kicks. These films even impacted the culture of the time. Suddenly, backyard dojos popped up everywhere, and nunchucks were on every kid's Christmas list. But spy films and westerns and war flicks and martial arts films aside, the true era of the blockbuster action film was definitely the 1980s. The 1980s were all about pushing the boundaries of special effects and stunt work. The special effects budget on some of these films probably surpassed the GDP of some small countries. This is the era where Hollywood wanted to finally answer the question, can my explosions have more explosions? It discovered the answer was a resounding yes, and they've been using explosive explosions ever since. Now, this was the time period that saw a shift towards action narratives that were larger than life. Forget ordinary problems. Heroes had to save the world from alien invasions, from cyborgs, or from rogue soldiers. The result? Action plots that made as much sense as a cactus in a fashion show. But boy, were they popular. This was a time when the stars didn't just act, they made sure to take a moment to flex while they did it. John Wayne was tall, but he was a rather bland-looking guy. Bruce Lee was cut, but he was pretty modest in size. And the James Bond character was just cool and well-dressed. But the 1980s wanted to inject some steroids into the game. The 1980s wanted bulky physiques. Enter Arnold, sound it out, Schwarzenegger, and Sylvester, don't call me Sly. Well, yeah, okay, actually you can call me Sly. Stallone. These guys weren't just action stars, they were walking, talking mountains of muscles, with the charisma to match. It was the decade where biceps had top billing, and if you didn't have biceps, were you even an action star? Stallone first became a star with his 1976 performance in Rocky, in which he played an underdog boxer, one of the most iconic roles in history. But that first Rocky film was more about drama. Spoiler alert, he doesn't even win at the end. It can't be an action film if the hero loses. But most of the Rocky sequels, where he really looked jacked, and he always won in the end, dropped throughout the 80s, and they had a different flavor. Rocky never lost in those films. He was the champ of the world, overcoming intimidating fights like Mr. T's character Clubber Lang, or the Ivan Drago character, who was quite nonchalant about whether or not Rocky lived.
If he dies, he dies.
Those were more traditional action films, with villainous bad guys. He also had another iconic action film character in Rambo, a rough and tough Vietnam vet with what today would likely be called PTS, but back then was simply written off as shell shock. Schwarzenegger, on the other hand, was a bigger star. Well, at least physically bigger. And he had all types of successful action films. He played Conan the Barbarian, in which he got to show off his impressive physique. He starred in Predator, in which he played Conan the Barbarian if Conan was a Marine. And in this film, he got to show off his impressive physique. He starred in Commando, in which he played Conan the Barbarian if Conan was in the Special Forces. In this film, he got to show off his impressive physique. But perhaps most memorably was his role as the Terminator. In this film, Schwarzenegger played Conan the Barbarian if Conan was a taciturn robot from the future, sent to destroy mankind. This role was different than the others because the Terminator was a villain, at least in the first film he was. And that was the role that allowed Arnold Schwarzenegger to show off his impressive physique. But we can't move out of the 1980s until we discuss what is perhaps the most influential action film of the modern era. And, according to some, the best darn Christmas movie ever made. Yep, you guessed it, I'm talking about Die Hard. Die Hard is the action movie that proved that you don't need a six-pack like Schwarzenegger to save the day. A receding hairline, a white undershirt, a charming smile, and an infinite amount of sarcasm will do just fine. Bruce Willis brought us John McClane. A man armed with more smarts than muscles, he was the everyman hero that redefined the genre. Before Die Hard, action stars were expected to be chiseled Greek gods, charming linguists, good-natured enforcers. But then came John McClane. McClane, who spent more time complaining about his rough day than striking heroic poses. He was vulnerable, he depended on luck, and he suffered his share of failures. He wasn't a mega man. He was just a New York cop with a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, often barefoot. Another thing the 1980s brought us was the action film franchise. This is where successful films with beloved action heroes would garner themselves sequels. Lots of them. The Rocky universe had 8 films in total, including the Creed series, and spanned 6 decades from the 1970s to the 2020s. Rambo had 5 sequels across 5 decades, although there was a 20-year hiatus in the middle. And Die Hard? Well, Die Hard had its share of sequels too. As a matter of fact, Die Hard didn't just redefine action heroes, it also introduced the concept of Die Hard in a insert random location here. Suddenly, we had Die Hard on a plane, Die Hard on a train, Die Hard in a taco stand. Alright, well, I'm not sure about that last one, but the point is, sequels became a big part of the action genre. And this continues today. If an action film does well, especially if the main character is lovable or admirable in some sort of cool way, there will almost certainly be a sequel. Not only did we see this with Rocky, Rambo, Terminator, and Die Hard, we would go on to see it with other epic action film franchises like Indiana Jones, The Matrix, Mission Impossible, Lethal Weapon, the Bourne series, Mad Max, and most recently, John Wick. Now, while some of the most popular action franchises with iconic heroes continued throughout the 90s, Hollywood also started to mass produce these types of scripts, so there were a lot of B-level film stars that emerged. Never quite as big as their predecessors, but some of them did alright for themselves. This included actors like Belgian ballet dancer Jean-Claude Is My Tutu Too Tight Van Damme, the man that made surnames sound cool. In many ways, Van Damme movies were the evolution of the martial arts film. But he wasn't the only one. We also had Steven I Am Not a Seagull Seagal, the soft-spoken hero who was notorious for bragging about his real-life martial arts skills that seemed somewhat dubious. The 1990s turned into the 2000s, and this led to the dominance of the superhero genre, which was a subset of the action genre. While 1978's Superman and 1989's Batman were both highly successful films with tons of sequels themselves, the superhero genre would really blow up in the 2000s. Their popularity wasn't just a trend, it was a full-blown cultural takeover, with movies like X-Men, Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the reimagination of Batman multiple times. This all laid the groundwork for a genre that would dominate the theaters over the next 20 years. It's as if a comic book store exploded and we've been living in a nuclear winter ever since. While other action franchises did become popular, like the Matrix series or the Fast and the Furious films, Hollywood focused tremendously on superhero films. It's as if Spider-Man had compromising pictures of someone with something in a shower. And if we're going to keep it real, Fast and the Furious is a superhero movie. Nearly every character in those movies may as well have special powers, particularly the power to defy sense or realism, and also the power to make tons of money. Now, it should also be noted that the action genre is popular abroad, too. Hong Kong is known for making lots of exciting action films, including the 1973 Bruce Lee film Enter the Dragon, which is iconic even to this day. Bollywood in India makes tons of action films, and they often combine them with romance or drama, making them multifaceted. Japan's been creating action films for decades, with 1954's film Seven Samurai being one of the most influential films of the time period. South Korea likes them too, with their film Old Boy being regarded as having one of the most shocking endings in an action film ever. Even the French have created their own versions of the action film, with films like the 1990s La Femme Nikita gaining tremendous popularity. And these films often use action sequences that helped popularize the jumping art parkour. Action, given its physical nature, is essentially understood in every language, and as a result, it's been proven to be popular across multiple cultures. With the advent of streaming, action films are accessible on every platform. Now you don't need to put on pants and venture into the outside world to witness epic explosions and heroic feats. You can enjoy it from the comfort of your own couch, crumbs on your shirt included. So what does the action genre hold in store for the future? Will we see heroes trading in their capes for jetpacks? Could explosions become more colorful? Will the next big action star be artificial intelligence? Who knows? But what's undeniable is the fact that action films are the comfort food of cinema, the mac and cheese of theater, and that's why it's a genre that transcends time. Action films will always be popular, and they'll never go out of style, except for when they do finally go out of style. But at that point, just watch the classics. They're the ones that did it first, and they're usually the ones to do it best.